All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this book launch for my new book. Yes, this is totally an unabashed self-promotion webinar, but it's so great to see so many of you. I figured the virtual format for this book launch was the best for this book because this is my pandemic book. It got written during lockdown, and so I felt it would be weird to do something in person. Zoom is the way, and so it's great to see all of you today. I'm just going to share my screen for the presentation slides, so give me a moment. And so, yeah, the idea for today is that I'm going to spend about half an hour giving you a teaser for the new book. And you should be able to see my slides now. Very good. And so, yeah, I'll give you a teaser for the book, and then we'll get into some Q&A and discussion about anything that interests you, anything that you pick up on during the presentation, or if you've had a chance to look at the book yet so far and you have some questions, or if you're just interested in other aspects of my work, you're more than welcome to ask about those as well. And so, yeah, anyways, welcome again. It's great to see many of you here with us today. For those of you who don't know me, I see some familiar faces. I see some new faces, which is exciting. I'm an associate professor in sociology and legal studies at the University of Waterloo. My name is Sarah Wilkins-Laflamme. My research interests, are definitely in the area of sociology of religion. I'm one of the kind of number experts on religion in Canada. That's become my thing over the last few years. So I work with Statistics Canada as one of their expert advisors. I work with a lot of government as well as survey data. And I also specialize in other sub-areas related to religion, ethnicity and immigration, social change, as well as political sociology. I'm really fascinated about the role that religion, spirituality, and non-religion play in our lives, how they affect different groups in society, the impact that they have in society, and how the social world impacts religion and spirituality as well. And so, yeah, this talk today is all about the new book. You'll have my contact info up on the slide. If ever you're interested in getting a hold of me, please do. But yeah, this is the new book that I wrote up. Like I said, it was my pandemic project. When the first COVID-19 lockdown hit Ontario in March 2020, I found I had some extra time on my hands. I did not have small children, and so there was more time available to me. I was fortunate to have that extra time on my hands because, conference travel wasn't happening, in-person events weren't happening, so that kind of freed up a bit more of my work time. And so I was looking for a project that, would keep me occupied and also provide, some kind of consistency in that daily work routine at home. We all experienced it to a certain extent of working at home. So this was kind of what kept me going, was kind of what I look forward to, at least work-wise in the morning throughout the first few lockdowns. So I'd been involved in a number of studies collecting data on religion, spirituality, and non-religion amongst millennials since 2016. And so this was a book that I'd been meaning to write for quite a while, but you never really find the time until that pandemic hit, and it turned out that I did have some time. So that's why I wrote it up. The idea of the book is it's not a super big book, right? This is not a 700-page or anything. It's quite short. That's the idea. It's kind of short and sweet. And it's what I call a data presentation book. Right, so this book was kind of inspired by and is in the style of my favorite type of books in sociology of religion, books that I, read throughout my career so far by authors like Christian Smith and Patricia Snell, Robert Wuthnow, and Reginald Beebe's earlier work, where their new research data, both quantitative and qualitative, really forms the heart of the content of the book, and arguments are built on these empirical data. Right, so my book builds on this work of the previously mentioned scholars, as well as others as well, and also is updating data, findings, and arguments for the millennial generation. Right, and the book was also an opportunity to give a more grounded account of. Just a moment. Yeah, we're good. Okay, sorry about that. So yeah, the book was also an opportunity to give a more grounded account of millennials and how they do religion, spirituality, and secularity in their everyday lives. I'd found a lot of previous work on millennials had tended to paint the generation as either kind of in two extremes, right? So either as this unhappy and entitled group of snowflakes responsible for all the society's problems, or on the other end, the generation on which we should be pinning all our hopes and dreams for a better future, right? So I was kind of finding there was a bit of a disconnect maybe from their views of what millennials were doing and maybe what we were actually as a generation of millennials experiencing on the ground. So, reality is probably somewhere in the middle of these two views. And, maybe it takes a millennial author like myself, who I'm born in 1987, so I'm an old millennial in that sense. Maybe it takes someone like me to help do away a bit with both those kind of dystopias and utopias tied by many older thinkers to my generation. Right. So the way I put in chapter 1 is that, the goal of my book is to do away with the baggage of both an extreme anxiety of stereotypes and a utopian hope for for a perfect future found among older generations dreaming or nightmaring about the young, and instead examine how things really are regarding religion, spirituality, and secularity for members of my own millennial generation. So like I said, the data in the book kind of forms the core, the heart of the book. If nothing else, if I just achieve to give you some new data and findings and insights through the quantitative and qualitative data, I'll consider that a success in this book. The research data I'm using comes mostly from the 2019 Millennial Trends Survey that I ran. I administered this survey online in March 2019, so pre-pandemic. In both English and French, the survey questionnaire contained about 69 questions on the respondents' socio-demographic characteristics, non-religious and non-spiritual affiliations, as well as religious and spiritual ones, beliefs and practices, friendship networks, as well as inclusivity attitudes. Surveyed a total of 2,514 respondents aged 18 to 35 from both the US and Canada. They completed each about a 15-minute survey. It took them about 15 minutes overall on average. Respondents were recruited through Léger's panel of registered members, right? Léger is one of those polling firms that has a large pool of registered members in North America, over 400,000. And so we pulled the smaller sample from that. And they completed the survey, which was hosted by the Survey Research Center here at the University of Waterloo. So a big thanks to them for helping me with that. Potential respondents were randomly selected within age, gender, and level of education quotas, and were sent an initial email invitation to complete the web survey, and were reminded up to about 2 times to complete it if necessary. The final response rate was about 7% using that technique, which is not uncommon for online surveys, especially for this demographic, the younger demographic of 18 to 35-year-olds. And, I made efforts throughout the data collection process to try and make it as representative a sample as possible. Representativity is never perfect, and we can talk about that some more in the Q&A if you want. But at least on some of the key demographic variables I have listed up here in the slide, like age, gender, education, regional residence, country of birth, race, ethnicity, and household income, the sample does seem to be pretty representative when you compare it to other big high-quality samples in both Canada and the US. I also use some other quantitative data sources to help to add to some of these results from the MTS, including data from the general social surveys and the 2 countries' national elections studies. I was also involved with 2 other research projects between 2016 and 2020 that collected focus group and interview data from millennials, including the Cascadia project out west, led by Paul Bramadad at the University of Victoria, which conducted a number of focus groups and life history interviews in British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest of the US. That research took place in 2018, as well as the Exiting Cultural Catholicism Research Project led by Martin Meunier at the University of Ottawa, which conducted just under 20 interviews with millennials in the province of Quebec. So these 2 research teams were very gracious enough to allow me to use their qualitative data from 18 to 35-year-olds to complement the survey data. So today in the presentation, you'll see some stats. You'll also see hopefully some qualitative quotes and to kind of complementing the quant data. All right. So let's talk about the framing of the study. And I'll start with asking the question, right? Like, who is a millennial? Especially for the purposes of this study, because in researching and reading up for this book, I realized there's a whole lot of debate about who a millennial is. I didn't realize this was such a debated issue, but it turns out that not everyone agrees about who falls into which generational category. So no one really agrees on exactly which year it was in hindsight that newborns switched from being Gen X to millennials, or also when they switched from being millennials to Gen Z, the next generation. Some authors or previous researchers will use Howe and Strauss's seminal cutoff dates of those born between 1982 and 2004 to group together millennials, right? So most of the 80s, the 90s, and the early 2000s, anyone born between that period would be a millennial, according to Howe and Strauss. The Pew Research Center and Twenge use instead a slightly earlier range of birth years. The Pew Research Center for Millennials usually uses the range of those born between 1981 and 1996. Twenge uses the range between 1980 and 1994. Others will still prefer a more even distribution of generations across 20-year periods. That's the case for Reg's work, as well as with Joel's in their book B.B. Thiessen and Bailey in 2019 on millennials. And so we'll define millennials as anyone born between 1986 and 2005. That's kind of the 20-year period that Reg uses and others in Canada uses is typically what I have in mind and what I use when I refer to millennials. So anyone born between the mid-80s to the mid-2000s. But, in my view, the exact dates aren't super important to the larger discussion. There's a little debate, and there always will be, right? Any cutoff year when you say like, okay, millennials stop, Gen Z starts, or Gen X stops and millennials start, any cutoff year is arbitrary in some sense. And we can talk more about this if you're interested, because it depends kind of what factors you put more weight to. That kind of depends who you consider millennials and when they're born. But for practical reasons, with the statistics, you'll find me using that 1986 to 2005 birth years throughout the book to refer to millennials. And in some other instances, I'll go a bit narrower than that. I'll just have access to a bit data of just adults 18 to 35 born within that range, and that represents most adult millennials. What is important is to generally encapsulate those individuals who were born and raised in the late 80s, 90s, and sometimes early 2000s, and individuals who moved into young adulthood in the 2000s, 2010s, and early 2020s at the turn of the millennium, hence the name millennials, right? We kind of became young adults, went into adulthood right at the turn of the millennia. So that's roughly a quick overview of who millennials are, practically who we consider them to be. Overall, if you take a step back in the field of sociology, there currently exists a number of important social divides, both in the US and Canada, along which strong differences in values and behavior appear between individuals, and according to which social experiences and opportunities vary greatly, right? So in sociology, we often focus on race, gender, and socioeconomic status, especially as, the basis for some of these important social divides. And, although these key sociodemographic determinants and their intersections all come into play throughout my book, the main focus of the book is nevertheless on another important fractured line, that of generation, right? So how are millennials different, in some ways at least, from older adults of older generations? Right? And the reason I focus on generational effects is because over my career so far, I found them to be especially crucial for understanding differences in religious and non-religious, or spiritual and non-spiritual identities, beliefs, and practices in today's North American societies. Right? And if I quote Karl Mannheim from his seminal work in the 50s on generations, it's with a new generation raised in, quote, a common location in the historical dimension of the social process, differentiated by the changing content of formal education, by peer group socialization, and by idiosyncratic historical experience, quoting Ryder, that changes in religiosity and spirituality become especially apparent, right? So I really do think that generational divide is a key important one, not the only one, but a key one, very important to understand religion and spirituality in North America, and that's why it's the focus of this book. All right, so according to Karl Mannheim, members of the same generation share in common a similar social location, right? I quote Mannheim here: the fact that people are born at the same time, or that their youth, adulthood, and old age coincide does not in itself involve similarity of location. What does create a similar location is that they are in a position to experience the same events and data, right? That's what makes them a generation, is that they grow up experiencing the same events, especially in the same kind of social environments, right? Individuals who are born and raised during the same period of time in a shared social environment are likely to experience aspects and events of this social environment as formative, and thus may go on to resemble each other in their attitudes and behaviors in key ways, distinct from other older and younger generations not sharing the same social location. So I'm not saying here that all millennials are the same. There's obviously differences within millennials and different social groups within millennials that make sometimes that drive different experiences. But I am interested in understanding, what is peculiar to millennials, what kind of trends do we see amongst this generation that we don't necessarily find elsewhere amongst older adult living generations today. All right, so my objective in the book is to explore with recent empirical data how millennials are different from the generations who have come before, since these differences are currently and will continue to have a significant impact on shifting American and Canadian religious and spiritual landscapes. So what's new and distinct about the millennial social location, coming back to Mannheim's terminology, making their lives different from those of their parents and grandparents, right? And this is what is actually up on the slide now. I examine in the book 8 interconnected societal trends throughout the book that are especially being felt by millennials, right, as they grew up and as they were socialized and still as they live their adult lives today. Right, so I'm illustrating the trends here. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail today, but again, if any of these interest you, we can talk about it more in the Q&A later on. But millennials are growing up in this social environment where the digital is very important, right? More than it has ever been. The millennials might be the last generation, can maybe call them maybe the last analog generation that grew up without so much internet or without smartphones. But even then, that depends the millennial, because for most of my life, I had at least a dial-up internet growing up as a kid, and hopefully it got better as I got older. But yeah, the digital age is very much part of that millennial social location. So are experiences of economic precarity. Now, yes, the millennials are going to inherit the largest amount of wealth in human history from their boomer and Gen X parents at some point in North America. We're talking about the North American context. That being said, that happened. That's happening a bit now. It'll probably happen quite a bit later in a few years or maybe in a few decades, that transfer of wealth. But for their emerging adulthood years, when the millennials were in their late teens and early adult years in their 20s, there was this experience of economic precarity. A lot of millennials came into adulthood right when the Great Recession hit in 2008. And then the kind of, for the later younger millennials, the pandemic lockdowns hits. And so there's been a lot of kind of job insecurity, a long period of kind of holding many jobs, spending more time on higher education, maybe not having as much career stability as previous generations had in their 20s. And that has kind of shaped the experience of millennials that, many are still going through today, but are kind of slowly now moving out of as they reach middle adulthood. The millennials are one of the most diverse generation, ethnically, racially, religiously, compared with older generations, right? William Frey calls that the cultural generation gap. There's a much larger proportion of visible minorities, of those who practice religions other than Christianity amongst millennials, more so than any older adult generation in North America. They're also kind of traversed by values of individualism, even to an extreme to a certain extent, values of personal choice, decision-making, personal authenticity, authentic experiences. These are all terms that millennials like to use and that they highly prize as values that they've kind of inherited, especially from the 1960s, societal transformations with the boomer generation. But we now find kind of even more pushed forward this kind of new forms of individualism amongst millennials today, and they really highly value those kind of individual choice, individual authority above all else. And you see it a lot in when they speak or when they answer surveys. You can see it amongst millennials. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. There's also kind of going on in the background, the environmental crisis. You know, for some it's more real, for some they're at least aware it's happening. You know, and so millennials, along with Gen Z, are probably going to be the generations in their lifetime that might see things get really bad towards the middle and the end of the 21st century. Hopefully, we live that long. But yeah, and so they're very much aware of this. They're aware of climate change. They're aware of wildlife and habitat destruction, and it's very predominant and prevalent in a lot of their thoughts and discourses, and they've grown up with it, right? And so this is another kind of key factor that's defining their social environment as millennials. Most millennials live in cities, something like 90% in North America. And so most are having an urban experience. Not most, but a big chunk, the largest proportion of any adult generation today have gone to college or university. It doesn't mean every millennial has, but more have than in previous generations. And those who don't go through higher education are also more greatly impacted by that fact. They don't have access to as many jobs as they used to, right? Because more are going to university, a university degree is becoming expected in more jobs now amongst millennials. And so that kind of expanded higher education is affecting everyone in a certain way amongst the generation. And finally, you know, to wrap up on this overview of what millennials are experiencing in their environments, the environment they were socialized in North America, there's also this prolonged period of emerging adulthood that millennials are going through, right? Back in the day, say, think about our boomer or silent generation parents or grandparents, you know, by the early 20s, they had usually bought a house, had gotten married, were probably expecting a child on the way, you know, had more stable careers, either if they're women as homemakers or in the labor force. Now that's quite rare, right? There's a much longer period for millennials and younger generations today of, you know, in your late teens, you stay home, you stay in your parents' house for a lot longer than you used to. Maybe that's because you decide to go to college or university, or you're able to go to college or university. That kind of drags out that period of more transition and mobility of emerging adulthood, where you don't necessarily have a stable home location or a stable job or one career job yet. And that can last throughout your 20s or even into your early 30s amongst millennials. And so that's having that kind of more transitional mobile time of life of emerging adulthood is impacting millennials' religion and spirituality as well. Okay. So, you know, this is by no means an exhaustive list of all things new amongst younger generations, right? And in another sense, Wuthnow, for example, identifies many of these same trends as influential for the life worlds of young adult members of Gen X as well, right? So not all of this is new to millennials. Not all of it is solely distinct to millennials, but these are some of the key trends that really influence their formative teen and young adult years, and you know, and that also have an impact on, you know, how they kind of think of and do religion and spirituality in North America, right? So these 8 interconnected trends are key elements of our current social world that have had an especially profound impact on millennials. It is members of this generation who have been socialized within this new social environment during their childhood, teenage, and young adult years, and who are being shaped in all aspects of their lives by these trends, including in their religion, their non-religion, and spirituality. Religion doesn't exist in a silo from other dimensions of the millennial social location, but is instead impacted and shaped by them, as well as in turn having its own impact on the millennial social location. Okay. All right. So I'm cognizant of time, so I'll keep us moving along here. You know, I can talk about this stuff all day, but I don't want to keep you here all day. You know, I wanted to cover some of the key categories and methods used in the book that I use throughout, and that kind of helps structure the chapters of the book. One of the analyses I did with the Millennial Trends Survey data is called a latent class analysis. A latent class analysis is a type of statistical model that looks at how respondents answered a series of questions on on the survey, and from this information extracts a number of underlying groups or latent classes. In other words, this type of statistical analysis identifies patterns in respondents' answers to survey questions and groups them accordingly into different underlying categories or classes of individuals. Right, so it's a statistical way of building a categorization with the survey data. In a sounder way than just using 1 or 2 questions, but gathering a whole group of questions together and seeing the patterns of responses amongst respondents. So the survey questions are up here on the slide that I included in this analysis. So they were ones I asked in the survey, things like religious affiliation, belief, worldview, frequency of spiritual activities, prayer, religious service attendance, reading religious and spiritual materials, making offerings to ancestors, digital religious and spiritual content, celebrating rites of passage with religious groups, as well as discussing religion and spirituality with friends. These were all things I asked respondents about and that I plugged into this latent class analysis to kind of categorize, depending on how people answered these questions, kind of categorize them into different groups of how they approach religion, spirituality, and secularity. So from this analysis, I ended up with 4 key categories or latent classes of millennials that structure the book and that I really get into in the book. So I have my first group I call them religious millennials, second group spiritual seeker millennials, third group cultural believer millennials, and fourth group non-religious millennials. To borrow wise words from Smith and Snell's book in 2009, every typology is, of course, an oversimplification and needs to be used with caution. Not every last person falls neatly within one category or other. Some people seem to straddle types and others are simply very unique. Nevertheless, empirically informed categories that represent major differences in groups of people can bring helpful analytical clarity to what would otherwise be a complex mass of data, right? So these categories, they're not perfect. We can chat about it, obviously, but they do kind of help us to give an overview, a sense of, how are millennials approaching religion, spirituality, and non-religion in different ways in their everyday lives. Right, and that's the goal of building and using these categories, providing helpful clarity within a kind of large mass of data that I have. So let's take a few minutes now to explore each of these 4 categories, starting with the religious millennial. So the religious millennial category groups together young adult respondents who are more likely to have a religious affiliation. So most in this category, the vast majority do. They tend to say they believe in God according to the teachings of their religion. Right, without exception, these respondents also score highest on all religious behaviors contained in the analyses, including the more personal, group, and digital religious practices. They also have about a bit of a chance, about a 25% chance of taking part in unchurched spiritual activities on top of their kind of more traditional forms of religiosity, if you want. Things like meditation, yoga, outdoor activities as well. And I put up here an example of one of our focus group members, Kamal, from out west, who was born in 1989 and who took part in the focus group from the Cascadia Research Project that was conducted in Vancouver in 2018. And he's a typical religious millennial in this sense when he says, I think growing up post 9/11, there's a lot of media attention on what it is to be Muslim. And I think it became a strong part of my identity because of that. I go to the mosque on Friday, pray in congregation. When Ramadan comes around, I don't want to be breaking fast by myself in my apartment. I want to be with people who have also been fasting. So he does quite a bit of activities related to his religious group. And so in his case, he's of the Islamic tradition, but religious millennials touch on a number of traditions, but they are more religiously diverse than in previous generations. So there definitely are more kind of people who practice faiths outside of Christianity within this religious millennial category than, say, if you looked at religious members of older generations. The second latent class I call spiritual seeker millennial, right? These respondents who fall into this group are characterized by higher probabilities of having a religious affiliation, maybe not as quite as high as religious millennials, but still pretty high. They believe in God, but often in their own way, not necessarily tied to the specific teachings of religion, but in their own way. That's how they answer that question. And they have average kind of mid-levels of religious behavior. They're less religiously active in religious groups than our previous category of religious millennials, but there is still some link and connection with religious groups, just maybe not as frequently as you'd find amongst the previous category. Right? So what you do find amongst the spiritual seeker millennial, though, is the highest rate of individuals who say they'll attend unchurched spiritual activities, so spiritual activities outside of what we can consider as traditional religious groups. And they're the largest group that will self-identify as spiritual, right? So here we have an example of Stephanie, who's a self-identified spiritual but not religious individual born in 1986 and who took part in the focus group in Seattle in 2018. And Stephanie said, I tend to get a hippie label in my group of friends, so if I start spouting off something about, Mother Universe and us all going back to the same dust that we came from and being part of one big energy that we can't really explain. I've considered Buddhism, I guess, especially, or just meditation practice. I guess things like convening with nature and being in nature and playing music to me are my everyday spiritual practices. And I find meditation activity and being with other people in my own way. I haven't felt compelled to seek some other kind of structured community that's specific to a religious creed. It's like I was raised by two people from very different cultures from this region, and I've never really felt like I had a culture that I inherited. For me, it was very much that I built my own culture, beliefs, philosophy from the ground up. That, like, obviously all of our parents influenced us, but I feel like my culture comes very much from myself. And there's definitely a strong vein of getting back to authentic culture that stems from people's actual needs and feelings and behaviors. So Stephanie here personifies this type of spiritual seeker millennial in many ways. And again, you can see, especially through the last part of her quote there, that, those values of authenticity, of kind of building her experience from the ground up are very important, even though we as sociologists know that individuals are impacted by their socialization, their social environment. The individual millennials really like to talk about how they're kind of taking charge and they're the ones who are making choices and are kind of rebuilding their views of the world, their culture from the ground up, or many millennials are, including amongst this category of spiritual seeker. It's important to note here that this millennial spiritual seeker often appears to be done partly within traditional religious groups and partly without. We as researchers tend to treat the concepts of spiritual and religious as distinct, right? Religion often referring to beliefs, behaviors, and identities tied to more conventional religious groups compared with less conventional spiritualities. But empirically, what I've noticed is that there's a lot of entwining of the two, right? So the spiritual seeker millennial, they're for the most part are not necessarily completely removed from religious groups, but maybe not quite as active amongst them as the religious millennial is. The third latent class or category that I use in the book, I call the cultural believer millennial, is characterized by very high probabilities of religious affiliation, high probabilities of belief in God, especially in their own way, right? They like to say that I believe in God, but in my own way. But there's not a whole lot of religious behavior tied to that, right? So this is that kind of group that will identify, especially for, they'll say for cultural or family heritage reasons, they'll still have a certain affiliation to a religious group, but there's not a whole lot of activity tied to that. They don't regularly attend services or necessarily pray all the time or very involved online with a religious group. But that religious identity is still very important for them, right? They just don't pair it with frequent religious or spiritual activities. The example of Andrew here, born in 1988, identifies as Jewish and took part in a focus group in Seattle in 2018, personifies many of the dimensions of the cultural believer millennial when he says, I used to pray, I don't anymore outside rare occasions in community space, then it's communal driven, that's for sure. I think I take part in ritual spaces, but as a shared cultural experience, which I think is often bolstered by a certain nostalgia or continued tradition, or whatever the thing is that makes us do things when we wouldn't otherwise, because it's what we grew up with, because we share that familiarity within a space. And finally, the fourth category that's prevalent throughout the book is the non-religious millennial, right? So this fourth and final latent class is characterized, in contrast to the other three, by a very high proportion of respondents who don't identify with a religion or a spiritual tradition. all the averages of religious behavior, without exception, are at their lowest amongst this non-religious category. Spiritual activities outside of traditional religious groups are also, a bit present amongst this category, but also relatively low. And there's, instead, there's often a more common worldview that's more associated with materiality and science and a scientific worldview. That's more common. It's not amongst all the non-religious, but it is more common here amongst this category. Also quite common is a lot of uncertainty surrounding their beliefs, as well as indifference towards believing or not believing amongst this group. An example, Carrie here, born in 1992, and who Lynn Marks, one of our colleagues from the Cascadia Project, interviewed about her life history in 2018. Kelly is a typical non-religious millennial. When asked how she would define herself in relation to religion, Kelly answers, I don't know. I wouldn't describe myself as anything, really. I don't really know. I haven't been exposed to different religions, so I don't really know what I define myself as. I just really wasn't exposed to religion. I've never taken the time to learn about it enough for me to create an opinion or educate myself on it. It hasn't been something that I've found to be necessary for me to live comfortably here in the city, or to even find friends or anything like that. And we as a family, concluded that if there was some greater power, some God, then things that are so horrible wouldn't be happening to people, right? So Kelly is one example of a non-religious millennial. I have another example here of Sarah, who's a bit more anti-religion in her quote, but I'll skip it because I'm running I'm running very low on time here. So I'll leave that up to you. I'm always happy to send you the slides if you like for more info. Okay, so, those were the 4 categories I'm using in the book. Here's roughly the kind of proportional size of each of them across the Canadian American young adult population of 18 to 35-year-olds, according to my Millennial Trends survey data. The non-religious category is largest in Canada. The religious category is largest in US still amongst millennials, but it's that non-religious category that has grown the most amongst millennials compared to older generations. And so even in the US, that 26% of non-religious millennials, that's higher than it has been in the past from all the data and findings that we can gather in the existing literature, right? The spiritual seeker, cultural believer categories, they're definitely important there. They're definitely a sizable chunk of the millennials, but they're not necessarily the largest categories amongst the generation. And so those 4 categories form the basis, the core chapter structure in the book, right? We've talked a bit about that millennial social location that I delve more into in the first chapter of the book. Different approaches in chapter 2 to millennial religion, spirituality, and secularity is where I introduce the 4 categories that we just covered. And then each of the chapters in the book from chapters 3 to 6 kind of spend a whole chapter on each of the categories, right? So in chapter 3, I'm looking at the religious millennial and different dynamics within that group. And so I have a special focus there on digital religion, as well as on their political attitudes and issue stances, as well as how they're kind of experiencing or feeling the pressures or cross pressures from non-religion amongst a generation where non-religion is more of a thing than it has been in the past. And so how that affects even those who do practice religion. In chapter 4, I look at the spiritual seeker millennial. I kind of look at how we conceptually distinguish spirituality and religion, but in practice, we actually find both amongst many respondents, and they're intertwined. And so maybe we should, start thinking of them more in that way, as well as, how nature and the outdoors can be important spiritual resources for millennials who are not necessarily involved with religious groups, but who are looking for those spiritual experiences. Chapter 5 looks at the cultural believer millennial. Right, I don't, some people tend to brush this category aside, like, oh, they're just affiliated, but they don't actually practice a religion, or they're not actually involved in a religious group. I don't want to have that view here. In the book, what I identify is that religious identity, even though it's not tied to practice, is still quite important for these cultural believer millennials, right? And so I explore that, why is it important to them? How is it tied to family heritage, kind of these traditions, this nostalgia that's very important for these millennials, as well as how does it create boundaries sometimes, or stronger in-group and out-group attitudes, right? Like, oh, we Catholics or we Christians versus those Muslims or those members of other minority religious groups. There seems to be a bit more of that boundary definition happening, if you say it in a nice way, more of that in-group and out-group distinction amongst cultural believer millennials than amongst any of the other three categories. So how that works exactly, why is that the case? And also, you know, admitting that this cultural believer group seems to be that transitional category towards non-religion. It's very rare that a cultural believer will change to being a religious millennial, or that their kids will go back to being quite more actively religious. What's much more common is the cultural believer is kind of a transition, often on the way towards non-religion and the non-religious category. And then finally in chapter 6, I do look at that non-religious category more, right? Defining what non-religion is exactly, or at least how I use it in the study. You know, how millennials have switched into non-religion, especially from their parents, right? Many millennials have the same religious identity as their parents did, but when they do switch, they often switch to disaffiliation. They often leave religion, as well as the different ways you can be non-religious. You know, I can't have time to go into all of these aspects in detail. Obviously, I'm already running over time. You know, if any of these things interest you, we can get into them in the Q&A, which I promise is coming. But I did want to finish on a few of the key arguments of the book that I explore, especially in the conclusion of the book, right? And so, you know, let me first speak to cross-generational continuity. What do we actually find amongst millennials that we have seen in the past and that continue amongst the younger generation today, right? There is still much of that generational continuity when it comes to religion, spirituality, and secularity between millennials and members of older generations, especially Gen X and boomers. In many ways, millennials have not made some cataclysmic break when it comes to these phenomena compared with older adults, right? A majority of millennials have inherited and kept the religious identity of one or both of their parents, over 60%, and with it some key beliefs and practices. This means a large proportion of millennials in both Canada and the US still identify as affiliated to a Christian tradition specifically that comes from their parents, and still believe in God or a higher power, in life after death, and in religious miracles. Most millennials also continue the boomer and Gen X trends of not attending religious services regularly in both Canada and the US, and not praying frequently in Canada. Those were trends we saw in previous generations, and then millennials have kept going by not doing, basically. You know, in the four categories we just explored, you can find them amongst all the generations. It's not necessarily the nature of these categories that change so much, I would argue, but it's more the kind of distribution or how large each category is amongst the generation that is where we see differences. So getting into some of those cross-generational differences, right? It's that prevalence of the non-religious category that's much larger amongst millennials than in the past. That's one of the key trends we see in this generation. You know, in the book, I explore that those spiritual seekers and cultural believers, you know, even though they're present amongst millennials, they're more of a minority phenomenon now amongst millennials. They seem to have reached their peak more amongst boomers and Gen X, and millennials, you know, they're still there, but some people sometimes talk about spirituality as being, you know, something that engulfs everyone and an entire generation. Depends how you define spirituality here, but if you do take a more narrow definition that I use in the book of kind of, you know, spirituality referring beliefs, practices, identities referring to the transcendent or to things beyond the daily routine of daily life, but not necessarily tied to a more traditional religious group. You know, you do find some spiritualities amongst millennials, and they're very important to study, but it's not necessarily, you don't necessarily find them amongst the whole generation. And, you know, I tried measuring them in different ways, and we can talk about that. They are definitely important, but they're not necessarily amongst all millennials. And so building on earlier changes that occurred among their parents and grandparents, now it's that non-religious category that seems to have grown and gained more popularity, especially amongst millennials in both US and Canada, right? There's signs that this non-religion has become the default in both countries amongst millennials to a certain extent, right? No religion is the category that millennials are switching into the most when you look at intergenerational transmission between their parents and themselves. And there's very high retention rates of millennials who had non-religious parents who also identify as having no religion, right? The retention rates are very high, much higher than we've seen in previous generations. So it seems to kind of be that default category that those who aren't in it are switching into more and more, and those who are already in it stay in it as they move forward in their adult years. those religious millennials we talk about kind of having the sense of, being aware that other members of their generation are less religious themselves. And that kind of means that they have to defend their religiosity more, at least to themselves, as well as to other friends and acquaintances of their age groups. And as well as we kind of millennials move more towards middle adulthood, right? Many are now in their late 20s, 30s, even starting to get into their 40s. One of the key themes that came up amongst religious millennials especially was they were struggling with how they were going to pass their religion on to their children that they're very much thinking about because they're having them or they're planning to have them very soon. And they're struggling to, how do I pass on a religion in this more secular social environment or less religious environment? How do I pass it on without, also imposing it on the kids? They don't want to impose it because they value that independence, that of choice and decision making, and they want their children to be able to have that, but they also want to pass on their faith that they consider very important. So this is amongst many religious millennials that were interviewed or in focus groups. This was an important struggle that we saw, especially in the context of Quebec and the Pacific Northwest, that are less religious contexts, especially amongst a less religious generation, they're millennials. This doesn't mean the end of religion or spirituality amongst millennials by any means. They're a very important phenomenon in the generation. I feel they don't get the credit they deserve, the attention they deserve. But it is important to understand they are becoming more and more minority phenomenon amongst millennials, or we're now in a context of coexistence between larger non-religious groups as well as religious groups and spiritual groups that still remain important amongst millennials. And that creates a new dynamic, right? A new dynamic for those groups who are kind of, sometimes have very different worldviews, and who are aware of each other, especially the religious being aware of the non-religious, and that kind of it impacts how religion and spirituality and non-religion are done amongst this generation. Okay, I'll stop there. I'm so sorry. Way over time. I could talk all day about these things, but I won't. I want to leave some time at least for questions, discussion. So please jump in. Any thoughts? Anything that interests you? Rachel, go for it.
Thanks, Sarah. How fascinating. I'm really excited to read the book. I'm wondering, because I know that your kind of qualitative interview and focus data comes from the Cascadia Project.
From you.
From Quebec. Yeah,
from your team. Yeah.
But I'm curious how much of your categories are impacted by that versus the kind of broader survey data. And so I'm wondering about regional impact is what I want to hear more about. And if you noticed regional impact on the 4 categories as well.
Great question. Yeah. Okay. So the way I'm proceeding in this book, and whenever you use both types of quantitative and qualitative methods, one tends to be more dominant and the other one more complementary, right? And so the quant data is definitely the leader, is the driver in this book. And so the latent classes are the 4 categories were built from that latent class analysis. Initially just looking at the quant survey data, which did touch all of Canada and the US. Obviously, areas that have larger populations have more weight in that data, right? That's because of the distribution of respondents. And then once I had those 4 categories, I went to the qualitative data, and I'm interpreting the qualitative data a bit in that lens of those 4 categories, right? So I'm looking for examples, and I don't want to seem like I went into confirmation bias with all these qualitative data. I did keep an open mind, but I was finding that a lot of these respondents usually fell within one of these 4 categories. Sometimes they straddled 2 categories. And yes, the qualitative data is from 2 quite specific contexts. So BC and the Pacific Northwest in the case of the Cascadia data, as well as Quebec with the Exiting Cultural Catholicism interview data. And so these are contexts where you can really tell the religious millennials are really feeling that they're religious and that they're quite distinct from many members of their generation, because these are regional contexts where there's very large proportions of either people who say they have no religion out west, or in Quebec, cultural Catholics who might say they're Catholic but have very few ties and don't really like the church all that much. If I'd done interviews in the south of the US, it probably would have been quite different, right? And so yes, the regional context has an impact on these findings, especially the kind of what you see come through in the interviews. The latent classes is maybe less of the case. It's more kind of a broader survey results. Yeah. Cool, great question. Other thoughts? I'm looking at the chat. I'm trying to. We're going to talk about Caroline's book. Yeah. No, explores how it plays with tech industries. Spirituality in the, yeah, okay, so spirituality in the workplace in the tech sector. Did you encounter any of these perspectives in your research where millennials are expressing their spirituality in a capitalist productivity setting in the workplace? Thank you. That's a question from Colin. Great question, Colin. Listen, it wasn't really what I was looking for, the focus of this book so much. I know there is some interesting work being done on specifically spirituality in the workplace. What I will mention is in the survey, there was an open-ended question, basically saying like, okay, if you consider a spiritual experience something that takes you kind of beyond your daily life and kind of hooks you into a larger, connected, mysterious reality, you know, do anything that you do, would you define it as a spiritual experience? And it was an open-ended question, like write any kind of activity that kind of you would define as spiritual that you practice in your daily life. Work didn't actually come up that much. What came up a lot were examples that I was giving in the question, things like nature and outdoor experiences, things like art, music, time with family and friends, meditation, yoga, mindfulness were big ones too. People didn't necessarily specifically mention workplace, although, you can do meditation, mindfulness, and certain of those spiritualities in the workplace. But it's not something that I was looking to capture necessarily in my data. It wasn't the focus of the study. So I'm not seeing a whole lot of it spontaneously come up in the occasions where spontaneous data could come up. But I think there is something there. I think there's definitely some millennials are finding the spiritual experiences in the workplace helpful and as almost as a coping strategy in a very high pressure world and sometimes a precarious job world. But yeah, I think there's more research to be done. There's some people who are doing it so far, but yeah, it's interesting. Joel, you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Looking forward to reading the book, hopefully the next couple of months here. Two questions about the religious millennial group.
Yeah.
One, any sense among that group if they also favored this idea of giving choice to their children versus imposing? Okay, so you do see that among...
But they're struggling. They're doing that struggle, right? And you've talked about this before, and I'm sure you've come across it where they really want their kids to make choices for themselves, to be independent minded, right? Those are key values for them, as it is for many members of this generation. But they're also struggling, well, how do I pass on my faith to those children in a context where it's pretty much on me because they're not getting it at school, they're not necessarily getting it in the community as much. And so, the onus is on me to make sure that I pass on my religion to my children. How do I do that without forcing them into anything, right? And that's really, you can see that in the interviews, especially that we did in Quebec, where they're really kind of juggling this. Yeah, I'm going to try and walk this line and hope for the best kind of thing.
Yeah, okay, no, really interesting. And that aligns well with Christian Smith's recent book, Handing Down the Faith, with Amy Adamczyk as well. My second question is, any sense among the religious millennials of sort of digging their heels even deeper into their religious communities relative to a perceived or real kind of secular environment around them? Does that come up among millennials, or are they so entrenched within those more secular normative networks that it's not as prominent for them?
I don't know, at least in the context we were looking at, I don't know if digging in would be the right way of framing it. They definitely were aware that they were distinct, right? That they were like, there's not many people doing religion like we're doing, or being so involved with a religious group like we are. There was definitely, they didn't always see that as a bad thing either. They would kind of refer back to, well, we, in past generations, there were kind of people who just go to church for the social experience, for social status, or because they had to get their kids into school and into a religious denominational school, and so they're kind of more aware that they saw themselves as kind of more the true faithful, right? The smaller number, but that is more dedicated, the true religion. The word heart came up a lot, right? That it was really in their heart. Galen Watts refers to religion of the heart in a bit of a different way, but that kind of sense of for them, they were truly doing religion, whereas many members of past generations maybe had not, even though there was more of them, maybe they weren't as sincere in their faith. Whereas now, even though there's only maybe 4 of them at Sunday Mass, think of the Quebec context, who are of their age group, they're the really dedicated ones. So I don't know if they're not necessarily, they're aware of the kind of non-religious character of the environment around them. They're not necessarily fighting against it. They're just seeing it as, again, that kind of unique experience that's making their person and their lives very much important and meaningful, and they feel that they're experiencing that to a greater extent than maybe in previous generations have. Does that make sense? Is that what you're?
Yeah, that's
yeah.
great. Thanks, thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, great. Patricia, good to see
Thanks,
you.
Sarah. I'm looking forward to getting my hands on your book. If I heard correctly, you made a comment about the cultural believer millennials.
Yeah.
That they were more inclined towards some in-group, out-group kind of thinking. And they also are on their way into the non-religious category. Did you in any of your survey responses or the qualitative data that you had see something that that led you to come to some conclusion about whether there's any connection between participating in the in-group, out-group thinking and their shift into being non-religious?
Oh, I didn't see anything. I don't think I could measure that link. I was kind of talking to them about those two things in kind of separate sections of the chapter. So the in-group and out-group stuff. So I asked in the survey a lot of questions about attitudes towards things like immigration, minority religions, you find negative attitudes towards immigration and minorities across all millennial groups to a lesser extent than amongst older generations, but those attitudes are still present amongst some millennials, and to a bit of a greater degree amongst the cultural believers. Like, it's not a huge effect, but it is statistically significant. It is there that the cultural believer who has ties to a religious identity, but who is not involved on a regular basis with a religious group actively in their daily lives, they tend to have more of an us versus them mentality. And there's a few questions where I tease it out, and I tease it out a bit more in that book. And there is some support for that in existing findings, like Pew found, kind of looking at Christian identity and attitudes towards minorities, that Christians, especially Christians, that kind of cultural Christian group, did seem to have slightly more negative attitudes. I don't want to say they're all super racist or bigots. That's not what I'm saying here. But there does seem to be some kind of link there. Maybe in a religious group, they would find does have quite a bit of diversity in it now in many places in North America. Amongst younger age groups, those who are actively religious are quite diverse, more so than the rest of the population. Maybe they'd come into contact with more diversity, but if they're not involved in those groups, they're maybe a bit more removed from that contact with diversity. There's a few mechanisms I talk about. I'm kind of only have so much data that I can look into that. I think there's much more research that's needed there. What's actually driving this specific group to have slightly more negative attitudes towards certain minority groups? But it does seem to be a trend that's there, and I think it's worth exploring in more detail. That kind of, in the States, we talk about Christian nationalism. Maybe that's like an extreme version of that. But there does seem to be kind of underlying trends there to a certain extent that you see amongst millennials in both Canada and the US as well. Now, as a transition towards non-religion, again, it seems, those who say they have no religion often have parents who were cultural believers, right? Like, it's this kind of process, this intergenerational process. There are exceptions, but as a trend, we tend to see the grandparent was actively religious, the parent, often a boomer or Gen X, was somewhat related, still had some ties to religion, was socialized religiously with their own parents, but they were more of that kind of cultural believer group, or maybe a spiritual seeker group, and it's harder to pass that on without kind of a structured religious socialization to the next generation, who then is more likely to say they have no religion. That's that kind of intergenerational process at play. And so that's why I often see the cultural believer as, not always, but often this category that can transition either within one lifetime or across generations towards non-religion. That seems to be the process in play amongst not everyone, but a large chunk of this generation, and moving forward amongst younger generations now. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yes, makes sense. Thank you very much.
Cool. Abdi, you got your hand up?
Yes, thank you, Sarah.
Abdi.
Great work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just two quick questions. Did you see any impact of the minority status among these participants, given something that the recent research has shown that, for example, for Muslims, there has been sort of an embracing of religion in larger numbers as a response, as a reaction to the post 9/11 environment. So whether that minority status has played any role in their experience of religiosity or spirituality. And secondly, for the spiritual seekers, any information on what their understanding of spirituality is, as opposed to just rejecting what the established religion or organized religion is offering?
No, great questions, Abdi. I'll probably have some answers, and then it's more research is needed too. Okay, so for minority groups, listen, statistical data, general population survey or population survey amongst younger respondents, like this, my survey was the case, is not the tool par excellence to study minorities, unfortunately, right? They are smaller demographically, and so there's not as large a sample size of them to work with in survey data. And so with this survey, they weren't the focus, so I wasn't targeting them to get more of them to explore more amongst them. But they are there in the survey, and they do come through. We did interview some members of religious minorities in the focus groups that out in Quebec too, Kamal being the example. And Kamal, I gave us the example for the religious millennial, is one who did kind of feel impacted, like you say, by 9/11, and who kind of felt that kind of revisited his Muslim faith and kind of got re-involved in it to a certain extent, and is very kind of vocal and active in the community to kind of, push back against stereotypes that, have really come to the fore since 9/11. I didn't look into whether, some groups have become more religious as certain events have happened, or as they grow older amongst minority groups. You do have higher levels of active religiosity amongst those minority groups, right? A much higher percentage, almost half of religious millennials in the survey are from various minority groups, and ethnic minority and religious minority groups. So it's a very diverse category, more so than ever before. But that's kind of the extent that I go beyond it. I do include some of their experiences and stories, but I don't look at them specifically and their religiosity specifically and how it might differ from others, because it's not really the data to be able to do it with. Now, the spiritual seeker, again, a great question. It wasn't asking respondents about how they define their spirituality as maybe distinct from religion or different from religion. It was kind of, in some ways it was a theme that traversed many of the focus groups and interview data, but at the same time, it wasn't necessarily a question that was always directly asked to those research participants. I gave them some choices in the survey, and what you often find is a lot of people who believe in a higher power, but in their own way. That was one option I gave, and a lot of spiritual seekers like that option. Another one was this kind of what I call the mysterious worldview option, where it's like you don't necessarily believe in God or a higher power, but you do see the universe as this kind of interconnected and mysterious kind of world experience way of understanding the universe. And so those were quite popular amongst the spiritual seekers. Like I said, many of these spiritual seekers have ties to religious groups. They're not just as involved as, they're not necessarily going weekly or monthly, but many of them are going at least once a year attending a religious service, right? So they're not completely removed from organized religion either. And so some of their way of understanding the world is tied a bit to that, but some of it is kind of, some are looking through digital resources and are getting in touch with digital communities, and there's a whole variety of ways that they see and understand the world. I don't think there was necessarily one way they defined spirituality. I think it was kind of something that was important to them, that many kind of experience and do in key ways that are part of communities and that are quite common in our societies, like yoga, meditation were very popular, right? And so, again, I think that's an area where we need more research in the country, and I know some people are pursuing that, is, what are some of the key themes that we find amongst these spiritual but not religious individuals, right? So they're definitely there, and I tease out some of them in the book, but there's definitely more research to be done. Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. Got some questions in the chat. Jonathan asks, is the questionnaire available online? Yes, the link is in the book. And Jonathan, if you shoot me an email, I can email you the questionnaire. It is available online. I have an open access report where you can see the Millennial Trends questionnaire if you like. And in the book, when I use the questions, I talk about them as well, like how did I word the questions and how they're used. Al asks, any big surprises? What were you expecting, and what did you actually find? That's people who know me feel I have mixed feelings about the surprise question, Al. I was always taught that was the question you ask when you had no other questions. If you hadn't read the book yet or you weren't paying attention, I know that's not your case. I'm joking. I'm teasing you. Big surprises. I always try and approach, listen, obviously I'm a person. I bring a certain baggage with me of past experiences, of values, etc. But I do always try and approach the, research with not a blank mind, but a kind of emotional or value neutral stance. It's not perfect, it never is, but it's what I strive for. It's kind of like an ideal. I'm a bit of an old school. Some will call me a soft positivist in that way, is that I do try and take a step back and not expect anything, so that, again, so I'm not falling into confirmation bias. So I don't know if there's anything like, I don't know if surprise is a feeling I feel when I do this kind of research. It's a lot of kind of like stats work, and there's some things I'm interested by. I guess surprise was when I revisited the existing literature on millennials, how skewed it was, and how much of it comes from older generations who aren't actually millennials themselves, and how that influenced how they perceive millennials. I think that was definitely a trend that I was maybe surprised at how much it was in the existing literature. In terms of the findings, I've been working with data for a long time, for quite over 10 years now. So hopefully nothing, if something surprises me, it's sometimes because something went horribly wrong in the analyses. But I always love reading qualitative interviews because there's something always new there, right? All the focus group members, all the interview members, I can classify people nicely into 4 categories, and that's fine, but there's always something different and interesting on the qualitative side when you actually go and speak in depth with people over many hours. And so I think in the book there's some really funny and surprising bits that people will come up with that are maybe outside of what you can capture with stats data. And I think that was probably the most fun and exciting and surprising for me, was just to see how everyday people and millennials relate to how they do religion, spirituality, and non-religion, and how normal it is, right? And how fun they are in describing it. And there's many examples. I won't name one here, but there's lots of fun ones in the book. So that's how I'll answer that question.
Thanks.
All right. Okay, so we run a little bit over time. I'm always happy to stay on for longer if anyone has any more questions. I understand if you guys have to head out, but any last questions before we go? I don't see any hands raised. Give me a moment. I'll just kind of check, do a clear check. Okay, well, thanks all for coming out. It's good seeing you. I'll end the recording here. You guys have a wonderful weekend. I'm always